A man only 1 year into his tough job had been thrown into a public relations nightmare. 2 young women, both hitchhikers, were found murdered in country areas. One unsolved the other, now possibly solved Mary Schlais. But people were watching closely. Under direct orders from his bosses, Chief Crawford demanded an immediate arrest and conviction. The message was clear: bring justice for Mary, and make the public feel safe again. Early one cold March morning, the quiet of Leonard Croft's lonely lane in St. Croix County was broken by several official vehicles arriving. Detective Craig Koza, along with Sheriff Garrett Hines and Deputy Larry Sanders from St. Croix County, walked up to Lenny's rundown house. Lenny, surprised by seeing multiple law enforcement officers, was arrested without fighting back. His face, already pale, turned even whiter as they read the charges out loud. He was taken back to the Dunn County Sheriff's Office, where he was led into a small, plain interrogation room. The air felt heavy with tension and smelled of old coffee. Detective Koza sat across from him with a notepad open, his eyes steady. Sheriff Hines watched from behind the one-way mirror, silent. Commanding figure. Mr. Croft, Koza began calmly. We believe you have information about the murder of Mary Kathleen Schlais. Lenny fidgeted, picking at a loose thread on his pants. I already told you, I don't know anything about that. We found a pack of Marlboro Reds in your car, Mr. Croft. Koza continued steadily. And a cigarette butt of the same brand was found at the crime scene, just feet from Mary's body. Your car's tires match the tracks we found. And you fit the description of the man Dennis Brown saw arguing with Mary that day. Lenny's eyes darted around the room, avoiding Koza's stare. That doesn't mean anything. Lots of people smoke Marlboro Reds. My Koritz, just a yellow sedan. Nothing special. His voice was barely a whisper, filled with desperate, weak denial. Then tell us where you were, Mr. Croft. On February 15, 1974, between 10:30 a.m. and 1:30 p.m., Koza pressed, leaning slightly forward. Give us an alibi. Lenny's face crumpled. He opened his mouth, then closed it, shaking his head. I can't. I won't. He took a deep, shaking breath. I want a lawyer. The short conversation, filled with Lenny's stubborn silence and refusal to cooperate, only made the investigators more convinced. The city police and other authorities, pushed by Chief Crawford's urgent demand, worked together to bring Leonard Croft to trial quickly. Within weeks, the St. Croix County Courthouse, a grand old building with impressive stone columns and echoing hallways, began to buzz with whispers from a community eager for answers. The courtroom was packed, showing how much the public wanted justice. Reporters crowded together, their cameras flashing, capturing the sad faces of Mary's parents, Michael and Penelope Schlais, and her brother Don, seated in the front row. They looked at Lenny with a mix of grief and simmering anger. District Attorney Cole Maddox, a sharp, ambitious prosecutor, opened the case for the state with chilling precision. He painted a picture of Leonard Croft as a loner, an evasive persona man who preyed on a vulnerable young woman, then coldly threw away her body. He carefully laid out the circumstantial evidence, each piece a thread in the damning tapestry. Then Dana Whitlock, Lenny's defense attorney, stood up, a hard-working but overworked public defender. She knew the uphill battle she faced. Public opinion was a roaring beast, already convinced of her client's guilt. In her opening statement, she tried to calm expectations. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she began, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. The prosecution will present a case built on suspicion, on coincidence, and on assumptions. But suspicion, however strong, is not proof. Coincidence, however unsettling, is not fact. The trial unfolded a tense legal drama. District Attorney Maddox called his first witness, Kathy Hobley. Kathy, visibly nervous, told about her call to the St. Croix Sheriff's Office, describing her neighbor Leonard Croft and his unsettling resemblance to the composite sketch. Maddox skillfully guided her, emphasizing her responsible nature and the importance of her civic duty. Dana Whitlock rose for cross-examination, her expression firm. Miss Hobley, she began crisply, you testified that you saw a sketch in the newspaper. You did not, in fact, witness the crime, correct? No, I just saw the picture, Kathy admitted, wringing her hands. And you testified that Mr. Croft owns a yellow sedan, not a gold one, correct? Dana pressed, yes, yellow, Kathy confirmed, her eyes darting nervously. But it looked similar in the snow. So your testimony rests on a resemblance to a drawing and a car color that is merely similar. Possibly due to lighting conditions, Dana concluded, letting the meaning hang in the air before releasing the witness. Next, forensic technician Warren Dade took the stand, detailing the discovery of the Marlboro Red cigarette butt near Mary's body and the hard-to-trace tire tracks. District Attorney Maddox walked him through the process, displaying grainy photographs of the evidence. And were these findings consistent with evidence later collected from the defendant's vehicle, Mr. Dade? Maddox asked, his voice ringing with emphasis. Yes, sir, Warren Dade replied, a lean, serious man. The cigarette brand was a direct match for a pack found in Mr. Croft's sedan, and the tire tread patterns and dimensions were consistent with his vehicle's tires. Dana Whitlock stood for cross-examination. Mr. Dade, she began in a measured tone, how many brands of cigarettes were sold in Minnesota in 1974? Warren Dade blinked. I couldn't say precisely, ma'am. Many. And Marlboro Red was one of the most popular brands, wouldn't you agree? Smoked by millions. Asterisk, it was widely available. Yes, Dade admitted carefully. So the presence of a Marlboro Red cigarette butt at a crime scene is hardly unique, is it? Dana pressed, her voice rising. And consistent tire tracks, Mr. Dade, are not the same as a definitive match, are they? Millions of cars made by the same manufacturers share similar tire patterns. There are variables, Dade admitted, uncomfortable under her gaze. But the overall impression was consistent. Consistent, but not conclusive. Dana underscored, thank you. Mr. Dade, she returned to her seat, a small, defiant victory in her posture. But the prosecution's narrative, fueled by the clear desire for answers and Chief Crawford's relentless pressure, had taken root. District Attorney Maddox called more witnesses, painting Lenny as a loner, an evasive figure whose very reluctance to cooperate screamed guilt. The jury, made up of local citizens, exchanged knowing glances, their faces showing growing certainty. During a tense recess on the third day of the trial, Dana Whitlock, her face grim with the weight of overwhelming evidence stacked against them and the jury's clear leaning, found Leonard huddled in the small deliberation room. Lenny, she said, her voice low and urgent, without accusation. They're going to convict you for murder. My attempts to discredit their circumstantial evidence, however valid, aren't enough. The jury believes you're lying about something. We have to tell them the truth about It's our last chance. Lenny's eyes, red-rimmed and fearful, met hers. The thought of exposing his cowardice, his past crime, filled him with dread. But the alternative was a murder conviction. He took a deep, shaking breath, then another. All right, Dana, he mumbled, his voice trembling. All right, tell them. When the trial resumed, in a dramatic turn that silenced the packed courtroom, Leonard Croft, guided by Dana Whitlock, stood and told his new, startling alibi to Judge Amelia Holloway and the jury. I wasn't in Wisconsin that day, Leonard Croft choked out, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes begging for understanding, fixed on his wife Cecilia Croft in the gallery. I was on that highway. I lied because I caused an accident. He told how on the morning of February 15th, he had been driving his yellow sedan on a sales route. Around 11 a.m., on a stretch of Interstate 35 south of Minneapolis near Owatonna, he had been distracted and hit a motorcyclist, sending the rider tumbling onto the shoulder. Panicked and uninsured, he had sped away, his heart pounding with shame and fear. He drove straight home and scrubbed his car, trying to hide what he had done. I was a coward, he confessed, tears streaming down his face. I was over 100 miles away from where that poor girl was found. I didn't kill anyone. I was just afraid to admit to the hit and run. His desperate admission hung in the air, a pathetic attempt to explain his evasiveness. But to the jury, already convinced by the circumstantial evidence and Lenny's prior denials, his new testimony sounded like nothing more than a desperate, last-ditch fabrication. It seemed like a ridiculous tale, spun purely to escape a murder conviction. The idea of him lying about a hit and run to avoid that shame, only to face a murder charge, was too convenient, too outlandish. The jurors exchanged knowing glances, their faces showing skepticism. Judge Amelia Holloway instructed them to consider all testimony. But it was clear that Leonard's new story had done more harm than good. After only a few hours of deliberation, the jury returned their verdict. The foreman, Franklin Stone, a serious man, stood, his voice clear and unwavering. On the charge of first-degree murder, we, the jury, find the defendant, Leonard Croft, not guilty. On the lesser charge of second-degree murder, we find the defendant, Leonard Croft, guilty. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. While not first-degree, it was still a conviction, confirmation of guilt. Judge Amelia Holloway sentenced Leonard Croft to 30 years in state prison. The gavel struck a sharp, final sound that echoed the closing of a chapter. Marking the end of the initial hunt for Mary Kathleen Schlais' killer, Leonard Croft was transported to the Minnesota State Prison in Stillwater. His world was reduced to concrete walls and iron bars. The news of his conviction brought a collective, though fragile, sigh of relief across Minnesota. Schlais' killer jailed, justice prevails, blared the headline of the Dunn County Tribune. For Michael and Penelope Schlais, a profound, if agonizing, sense of closure settled. Mary's murderer, they believed, had finally been brought to justice. The case of Mary Kathleen Schlais was officially considered closed. However, 8 months after that conviction, a legal move shattered the fragile peace. Dana Whitlock, Lenny's determined defense attorney, filed a petition for post-conviction relief based on newly discovered evidence, requesting the court to reopen the case and hold a hearing on the matter. The news sent ripples of confusion and skepticism through the community. Why, after a conviction, would a defense attorney try to overturn a seemingly settled case? It was only then that the story behind this newly discovered evidence began to emerge. For the entire 8 months, Leonard had been imprisoned. His wife Cecilia Croft, a woman whose resolve had only hardened through the brutal trial, had refused to believe in his guilt of murder. She remembered Lenny's upset state when he'd returned home that February night in 1974, his frantic actions to clean his car, and his tearful confession to her about the hit and run, shameful secret they had buried deep. Alongside Dana Whitlock, Cecilia had started a tireless, painstaking quest to find the motorcyclist from that fateful day. The task was enormous. The accident had happened on a remote stretch of Interstate 35 in southern Minnesota highway that passed through multiple areas. Verifying the identity of a long-vanished motorcyclist from a 1974 hit, where the driver was never identified, was a nearly impossible undertaking. For months, they chased every possible lead, sifting through old police reports, contacting various law enforcement agencies across southern Minnesota, and placing classified ads in local newspapers. Finally, through persistent inquiries with the Minnesota State Patrol, they found the accident report and eventually the motorcyclist himself. His name was Derek Langston, now living quietly in a small town in Illinois. Dana Whitlock and Cecilia Croft made the long journey, convincing Derek to testify. His memory, though faded by time, was clear enough on the core facts. He had indeed been involved in a minor hit-and-run accident with a yellow sedan on February 15, 1974, on that exact stretch of highway near Oa, and he vividly recalled the driver speeding away in a panic. He had suffered minor injuries and reported it to a local Minnesota state trooper at the time, but the driver was never found. The court granted the petition, and a new hearing was held. Leonard Croft, thinner and paler, was brought back to court less than a year after his conviction. This time, there was no jury, only Judge Amelia Holloway, tasked with reviewing the new evidence. Derek Langston's testimony, delivered with quiet sincerity, was central. He told about the accident, the yellow sedan, the date, and the panicked driver. His account, carefully supported by the original, though previously unlinked Minnesota police report, completely dismantled the prosecution's original case against Lenny. The alibi, once dismissed by the jury as a desperate lie, was tragically true. Judge Amelia Holloway, her face showing grim realization, looked down at Leonard Croft. "Mr. Croft," she stated, her voice heavy, "the evidence presented today proves beyond doubt your whereabouts on February 15, 1974. At the time, Miss Schlais was murdered. While your actions in Owatonna that day were wrong, they do not make you responsible for this terrible crime." With a deep sigh, she ordered Leonard Croft's immediate exoneration. The news ripped through Minnesota like wildfire, starting a storm of public outrage that far exceeded the initial relief. "Innocent man imprisoned, Schlais killer still free," screamed the headline of the Minneapolis Star. Another declared, "Justice system fails. Police pressure led to wrongful conviction." The city and state police, along with the courts, faced harsh criticism. Calls for resignations echoed from angry citizens and politicians alike. Chief James C. Crawford's tenure, already under scrutiny, now faced an impossible challenge. His mandate to make the public feel safe had backfired terribly. In a somber press conference held at the State Patrol headquarters, Chief Crawford, his face drawn and weary, addressed a crowd of furious reporters. "A grave injustice has occurred today," he stated, his voice low but firm, the flashes of a dozen cameras lighting his strained expression. "On behalf of the Minnesota State Patrol, the Minneapolis Police Department, and the entire law enforcement community, I extend our deepest, most profound apologies to Mr. Leonard Croft and his family. We failed him. We failed in our duty to uphold justice fairly. We will learn from this, and we will not rest until the true killer of Mary Kathleen Schlais is brought to justice." The profound relief for the Schlais family that a killer had been caught was violently replaced by renewed despair. Mary's parents, Michael and Penelope, and her brother Don, found themselves thrown back into the agonizing uncertainty they had believed was behind them. The case of Mary Kathleen Schlais returned to square one, grim unsolved murder that now also carried the heavy stain of a profound injustice. The files, once closed with a false sense of resolution, were now stamped active. Unsolved, a stark reminder of how hard truth can be to find. In the wake of Leonard Croft's exoneration, the lingering questions about Mary's killer, combined with the profound public distrust, cast a long cold shadow over the region. The state, still dealing with the earlier equally puzzling disappearance of Jolie, now seemed plagued by a series of unsettling, unsolved crimes. In the years following Mary's murder and Lenny's wrongful conviction, several other unsettling cases of young women disappearing or being found murdered along rural highways in Wisconsin and Minnesota would further increase the public's fear. Though none would be definitely linked to Mary's case, their existence deepened the terrifying sense that a predator roamed the vast, isolated stretches of the American Midwest. In the years that followed, Mary's case was reopened several times, brief flares of renewed hope that inevitably sputtered into the familiar darkness of a dead end. In the early 1980s, a new theory emerged, spurred by national headlines. Mary's killer might have been Randall Woodfield, a notorious serial murderer then terrorizing the Pacific Northwest. Woodfield had confessed to killing at least 44 people, and many of his victims had been picked up while hitchhiking, making him a chillingly logical suspect in Mary's case. Detective Rachel Denham, a diligent cold case investigator who had taken over Mary's file in the early 80s, carefully examined Woodfield's known movements and methods. But despite the haunting similarities in his predatory patterns, Detective Denham and her team were never able to find any concrete link, no geographical overlap, no specific alibi for Woodfield that placed him away from Wisconsin on February 15, 1974, but also no evidence that put him there. His DNA was already on file from other crimes, but without a sample from Mary's crime scene to compare. This led to eventually faded into the endless archives of possibilities. Over the following decades, investigators from Dunn County and the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension followed up on hundreds more leads. Their inquiries took them across nearly every U.S. state and even into Canada, chasing whispers and faint shadows, but the true identity of Mary's killer remained unknown. The relentless passage of time, the fading memories of witnesses, and the limitations of 20th century forensic science worked against them, slowly transforming a raw tragedy into a chilling local legend. In Dunn County, particularly in the quiet rural areas where Mary's body had been found, the story of the murdered hitchhiker took on an eerie, almost supernatural life. People began to report strange sightings. A young woman, slender and with long hair, walking silently along the roadside, her thumb out, trying to hitch a ride. But as soon as a driver looked away for a moment, she would vanish without a trace, leaving only the biting wind in her wake. Two local fishermen, Byron and Warren, claimed they saw a similar-looking woman near a secluded lake. They swore she was glowing with a soft white light, standing in silence, watching them from a distance before disappearing into the mist. Later, a local woman named Morgana, known for her deep religious faith and community involvement, came forward claiming that the murdered woman, Mary, regularly visited her in vivid dreams and spoke to her, seeking justice. These paranormal stories, fueled by the agonizing lack of resolution, eventually became far more well-known than the actual crime itself. Many people, particularly new generations in the area, didn't even realize that behind the chilling ghost stories lay a very real, brutal tragedy and a family's half-century of unrelenting sorrow. The case of Mary Kathleen Schlais, a vibrant artist with a passion for life, became a permanent fixture in the cold case files. A testament to justice denied. Sheriff Hines eventually retired in the late 1980s, his career closing under the heavy shadow of Mary's unsolved murder. Detective Kozar, now a seasoned lieutenant, carried that memory like an unhealed scar through the years, serving under a succession of new sheriffs, as the 1990s gave way to a new millennium. And then the early 2000s, investigative technology slowly advanced but still fell short of the breakthroughs that would later redefine forensic science. DNA profiling was in its infancy, not yet routinely used in cold cases, and genetic genealogy remained only a distant concept. The file on Mary Kathleen Schlais' homicide unsolved thickened with time. Its pages grew brittle. Its Polaroids faded to sepia tones, moving from active shelves to locked storage and eventually down to the basement archives of the Dunn County Sheriff's Office. Then, in the early 2000s, came a flicker of hope. The rise of DNA analysis was sweeping through law enforcement, solving crimes once thought impossible to crack. Inspired by these breakthroughs, Sheriff Graham Tully, the current head of the Dunn County Sheriff's Office, authorized a renewed look at Mary's case. He assigned Lieutenant Rowena Pierce, a determined investigator known for her relentless persistence, to lead the effort. When Pierce opened the aging case file, she felt the weight of decades of unanswered questions pressing on her. After consulting experts at the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension (BCA), she made a bold decision to exhume the body of Mary Kathleen Schlais in 2009. Don Schlais and his parents, Michael and Penelope. The order was heartbreaking. Watching Mary's grave disturbed rekindled the grief they had spent decades trying to quiet. Yet hope outweighed hesitation. Maybe, after all this time, modern science could finally give Mary a voice. Forensic specialists carefully examined the remains, focusing on potential traces beneath Mary's fingernails, the defensive wounds that had always hinted at a struggle. But despite painstaking work, the DNA was too degraded, too compromised by time and burial. The results came back inconclusive. It was a devastating setback. Still, Lieutenant Pierce refused to give up. One piece of evidence had survived the years intact: the distinctive orange and black knit cap found near Mary's body, with several short strands of male hair clinging to it. Forensic technician Darren Cole re-examined the cap using improved DNA extraction techniques. His team successfully pulled a partial Y's tRDNA profiler male's specific genetic signature that could identify paternal lineage. It wasn't complete, but it was something tangible, a fragment of the killer's identity. Pierce immediately submitted the profile to the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, CODA. For weeks, her team waited, hope flickering against the long shadow of the years. Then came the answer: no match. The killer's DNA wasn't in the system. He had never been caught or convicted of a crime that would have placed it there. The disappointment was profound, but the result wasn't meaningless. The partial DNA profile allowed investigators to eliminate several long-standing suspects. The notorious serial killer, Randall Woodfield, was conclusively ruled out, as were Dennis Brown and Walter Henderson, both excluded after quiet DNA comparisons. Leonard Croft, already exonerated years earlier, was now scientifically cleared beyond question. These exclusions brought a measure of clarity, even if not closure. The case was narrower, but no closer to resolution, a puzzle missing its final piece. Years drifted by. In 2016, Michael Schlais passed away, his final days shadowed by the unanswered question of his daughter's killer. Penelope followed in 2019, carrying her grief with her to the grave. Only Don Schlais, Mary's older brother, remains still writing letters, still making calls, still visiting the sheriff's office every February 15th. His hair had turned silver, but his resolve never dimmed. For him, justice had become a duty, a promise inherited from his parents, one he could not let go. By the early 2020s, Rowena Pierce, now a captain with the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, still carried Mary's file in her briefcase's silent reminder of unfinished work. The partial DNA profile still sat in CODIS, waiting for a match that might never come. Despite every leap in forensic technology, the case remained frozen in time, as if the truth itself had chosen to stay buried. In late 2022, inspired by breakthroughs in other states, Chief Julian Rivers of the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, a visionary leader with a deep commitment to cold cases, made a bold decision. She authorized the BCA to revisit the Mary Kathleen Schlais murder. It was, she declared, their absolute last real chance. Captain Rowena Pierce, with a renewed surge of hope mixed with professional weariness, was tasked with leading this monumental effort. She assigned the case to her most determined investigators, Detective Sergeant Isolde Cross, a sharp analytical mind known for her meticulous attention to detail, and Detective Quentin Lowe, a younger tech-savvy detective with a reputation for unwavering persistence. 50 years, Detective Lowe remarked, gesturing to the thick file on their conference room table. 50 years, and still nothing solid. 50 years, Detective, Captain Pierce countered, her gaze firm. And now we have a tool that didn't exist for 45 of them. This isn't just another cold case. This is a second chance at justice for Mary, for the Schlais, and for Leonard Croft. Their first step was to work with the Forensic Genetics Center at Ramapo College in New Jersey, specifically with Dr. Annika Sharma, a renowned forensic geneticist whose team specialized in complex cold case extractions. Dr. Sharma's team received the precious hair strands from the orange and black knit cap, carefully preserved since 1974. The challenge was immense. The DNA was partial and degraded. However, after months of painstaking work, Dr. Sharma and her lead genetic genealogist, Kaylin Reese, managed to build a comprehensive forensic-grade genome sequence from the tiny sample. This wasn't just a CODIS profile, it was a full genetic blueprint, rich with ancestral markers. With the genetic profile carefully built, Kaylin Reese and her team started the difficult journey through public genealogy databases. It was like assembling a massive, intricate puzzle with countless missing pieces tracing distant cousins, cross-referencing public records, old obituaries, and census data. For weeks, they worked tirelessly, following faint genetic trails back through generations. Eventually, their efforts paid off, landing on a potential family line with deep roots in rural Minnesota and Wisconsin. The genealogists developed a list of possible suspects, individuals whose family trees intersected with the unknown DNA donor. Detective Sergeant Cross and Detective Bowe received these crucial leads, their excitement tempered by the long, winding nature of genetic genealogy. Their initial focus narrowed to two individuals, Mateo Vargas and Laszlo Kovac's distant cousins within the identified family line. Both men had lived in the region in 1974 and fit some broad age criteria. Detective Sergeant Cross and Detective Lowe began discreet surveillance. They managed to obtain discarded DNA samples, a discarded coffee cup from Mateo at a local diner, and a used water bottle from Laszlo after a community event. Days later, the lab results arrived. Both Mateo Vargas's DNA and Laszlo Kovac's DNA did not match the crime scene sample. The initial surge of hope deflated, leaving the detectives with a familiar ache of disappointment. They had found relatives, but not the killer. It's a close relative, is older, that much is certain, Kaylin Reese explained over a video call, her voice tinged with professional frustration. but there's no one else in their known family tree who could possibly be the suspect. We've hit a wall with the standard genealogy. It was then that Dr. Annika Sharma, drawing on years of experience with complex cases, proposed a crucial new theory to Captain Pierce and her team. What if, Dr. Sharma suggested, her voice quiet but firm, the killer had been adopted? That would explain why he doesn't show up anywhere in the known family tree we've built. His biological lineage is clear, but his legal identity might be separate, breaking the chain in the public databases. The adoption theory sent a jolt through the cold case unit. It was a logical, yet incredibly challenging possibility. It meant digging through old, often sealed adoption records, a legally and logistically complex undertaking that could stretch on for months, even years. Privacy laws from the 1970s made access to such documents extremely difficult. Yet, it was the only remaining path. Captain Pierce, her eyes fixed on Mary's fading photograph, gave the order. "Find him," she commanded. "Whatever it takes, find him." The team started a difficult, careful, and legally complicated search through historical adoption records across Minnesota and Wisconsin, carefully cross-referencing names and dates, determined to bridge the genealogical gap. Finally, after nearly a year of relentless, intricate research, working closely with Dr. Junior Morrow, a legal genealogist specializing in historical adoption cases, they found what they'd been looking for. Based on everything they uncovered, a strong probability emerged. The biological relative they'd been searching for, the individual who would serve as the missing link in the family tree, was an 84-man named John Keith Miller. The identification sent a ripple of quiet awe and grim satisfaction through the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension BCA, Cold Case Unit. 50 years. It had taken 50 years to put a name to the man whose DNA had sat silent and unknown in a knit cap since 1974. Detective Sergeant Isolde Cross and Detective Quentin Lowe were immediately assigned to investigate John Keith Miller. Miller, born in 1940, lived in Owatonna, Minnesota, quiet, unremarkable town, far from the dramatic crime scene. At the time of Mary's murder in 1974, he would have been 34 years old. Squarely within the age range Dennis Brown had provided. His background, once carefully pieced together, revealed a life lived on the edges of public recorder, series of temporary odd jobs in construction and maintenance, a few minor arrests for public drunkenness and disorderly conduct in his younger years, but nothing that ever hinted at violent crime. Nothing that would have placed his DNA in CODIS. He was, to all appearances, an ordinary aging manor ghost in the system who had slipped through every traditional net. Detective Sergeant Cross and Detective Lowe started discreet surveillance of Miller. They spent days observing him, noting his routines, weekly trips to a small grocery store, quiet afternoons spent on his porch, occasional visits from his daughter. The detectives moved with careful, almost invisible precision. They knew the emotional weight of this moment. Not just for Mary's family, but for the justice system that had once wrongfully imprisoned Leonard Croft. They needed undeniable evidence. One chilly autumn morning in November 2024, their patience paid off. They observed John Keith Miller's daughter, Sophia Miller Jensen, leaving a local coffee shop. As she walked to her car, she discarded a half-empty coffee cup in a public trash can. Detective Lowe, with gloved hands, quickly retrieved the cup. The sampler, seemingly harmless piece of garbage, was immediately rushed to the BCA crime lab. This indirect method, gathering DNA from a close biological relative, was a carefully calculated step 2. Definitely confirm the family link before directly approaching the elderly suspect. Days later, the lab results arrived. The phone call came to Captain Rowena Pierce's office. Her team gathered around her, their faces showing tense anticipation that had spanned half a century. "Captain," the voice from the lab crackled. "The DNA profile from Sophia Miller Jensen is a 99.9999% match to the YSTR profile from the knit cap. John Keith Miller is, without a shadow of a doubt, the biological father of the individual whose DNA was found at the crime scene. We have our killer." A profound silence filled the room, heavy with the weight of 5 decades. It was a moment of surreal triumph. a quiet roar of vindication. John Keith Miller, the name once utterly unknown, now held the horrifying truth. The evidence was undeniable. After 50 long, agonizing years, Mary Kathleen Schlais finally had a name for her killer. The news was immediately shared with Don Schlais, now 78 years old. Don received the call from Captain Pierce in his quiet Minneapolis home. His hands trembled as he listened, tears welling in his eyes. 50 years, he whispered. My parents Michael and Penelope went to their graves without this answer. A wave of profound, bittersweet relief washed over him, mingled with an almost unbearable sorrow for the decades lost. The long, silent vigil was finally approaching its end. On the morning of November 7, 2024 to 50 years. And 8 months after, Mary Kathleen Schlais' life was brutally taken. The quiet suburban street in Minnesota, where John Keith Miller lived, saw a discreet but purposeful flurry of activity. Detective Sergeant Isolde Cross and Detective Quentin Lowe, accompanied by a small team from the Minnesota BCA, approached Miller's modest, well-maintained home. The contrast between the seriousness of their mission and the ordinary setting was stark. Keith Miller, then 84, answered the door himself. He was frail and stooped, with a long white beard and thinning hair that framed a deeply lined face. His pale eyes, though dulled with age, still carried a strange alertness. He looked more like a reclusive old farmer than the man detectives had been hunting for over half a century. The detectives introduced themselves calmly, their badges discreetly displayed, and asked if they could speak with him inside. Miller, perhaps used to minor brushes with authority from his younger disorderly days, agreed without obvious worry. They led him to a small, plain interrogation room at the Owatonna Police Department. The air, without the familiar smells of his home, now hummed with a different kind of tension. Detective Sergeant Cross began, her voice measured, as Detective Lowe quietly placed a single item on the table between them, the distinctive orange and black knit cap, carefully encased in an evidence bag. Its colors were still vibrant, even after half a century. Mr. Miller, Detective Sergeant Cross began, her gaze unwavering. We're here to talk about Mary Kathleen Schlais. Miller blinked, his eyes showing no immediate recognition. Mary who? I don't know any Mary Schlais. Never heard the name. His voice was raspy, aged. Mary Kathleen Schlais, Detective Lowe interjected, picking up the knit cap. Murdered on February 15, 1974, in Dunn County, Wisconsin. She was a hitchhiker. He pushed the evidence bag slightly closer to Miller. Does this hat look familiar to you, Mr. Miller? Miller glanced at the cap, then quickly away, a faint, almost imperceptible flicker in his eyes. He shook his head slowly. No, can't say it does. I don't wear hats like that. We believe you were with her that day, Mr. Miller. Detective Sergeant Cross continued, her voice soft but firm. And we have undeniable evidence. The male DNA from the hair inside this hat, Mr. Miller, is a 99.9999% match to your biological lineage. Your daughter, Sophia Miller Jensen, provided a sample. It's you, Mr. Miller. We know you were there. The words hung in the air, cold and definitive. Miller's emotionless composure, maintained for 50 years, visibly faltered. His face, weathered by age, went ashen. He stared at the knit cap, then at the detectives, his eyes wide with sudden raw panic. The facade crumbled. He let out a long, ragged sigh sound that seemed to carry the weight of half a century of unspoken secrets. All right, he whispered, his voice thin. All right. I picked her up. He leaned back in his chair, a profound weariness settling over his slight frame. The confession, when it came, was delivered with a chilling, almost detached calm, without any genuine remorse. It was February 15th, Miller recounted, his gaze fixed on some distant point, his words a monotone recitation of horror. I was driving my light blue sedan, heading east on the highway near Minneapolis. I saw her, pretty girl with a Madison sign. I liked picking up hitchhikers sometimes. Company. He paused, a faint unpleasant smile playing on his lips. She talked a lot about art. Young, full of ideas. We drove for a while, got out of the city. His story continued, outlining the horrific escalation. He had started pressuring Mary for sexual favors. his tone growing insistent, his demands clearer. Mary, brave and defiant even in fear, had firmly refused. She got angry, told him to stop the car. Miller recalled, his voice betraying no emotion. But I didn't. She struggled. In a sudden fit of rage, fueled by her resistance, Miller had reached for a knife he kept tucked into the visor area near the passenger seat, habit from his transient days for opening boxes or small repairs. He pulled it out and, without hesitation, plunged it into her repeatedly. She just stopped fighting, he stated flatly. The words painted a terrifying picture of casual brutality, a life extinguished with chilling indifference. He then drove Mary's lifeless body, slumped beside him, to the isolated rural road in Dunn County, Wisconsin, the same dead-end path where Dennis Brown would later make his horrifying discovery. I planned to bury her in the snow, Miller admitted, to hide everything. But as I was dragging her out of the car, a vehicle, Dennis Brown's pickup truck, drove by. Panicked and terrified of being caught, I jumped back into my light blue sedan and sped off, abandoning Mary's body by the roadside. The next day, Miller continued, a faint knowing look in his eyes. I saw the newspaper about the body. They said the witness saw a gold-colored car. I felt relieved. My car was light blue. They got it wrong. No one would ever connect it to me. His words confirmed the critical car color discrepancy that had plagued the initial investigation, providing him with a false sense of security for 5 decades. When asked about the murder weapon, Miller vaguely recalled tossing the knife into a swamp near his home sometime after the crime. Though he couldn't remember what he did with Mary's purse, he denied any involvement in other murders, including Jolie Trolson's case. No, just her, he claimed. A chilling simplicity in his voice. Don't even really understand why I did it in the first place. He confessed to no other crimes, offering no further explanation, no flicker of remorse. It was a cold, clinical account of a life taken, unburdened by guilt, for half a century. With his confession, the decades-long mystery was finally, horrifyingly solved. John Keith Miller was officially charged with first-degree murder and taken into custody to await trial. News of the arrest of John Keith Miller, seemingly ordinary 80 retiree, exploded across Minnesota and Wisconsin. 50-year cold case cracked DNA points to elderly man, screamed the headline of the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. The story quickly garnered national attention, a grim testament to the relentless march of forensic science. For the public, a profound sense of awe mingled with a chilling realization that a killer had walked free. Unnoticed for half a century, Captain Rowena Pierce of the Minnesota BCA Cold Case Unit, along with Detective Sergeant Isolde Cross and Detective Quentin Lowe, held a press conference that day. Surrounded by a wall of microphones, Captain Pierce, her voice clear and strong despite the emotion, announced the arrest. Today, she stated, we bring justice to Mary Kathleen Schlais, 50 years after her life was brutally taken. To her brother, Don Schlais, and to the memory of her parents, Michael and Penelope, who passed without this answer. We hope this finally brings some measure of peace. Later that day, Don Schlais, still processing the surreal news, met with Captain Pierce and her team. Tears streamed down his face as he shook their hands, his voice thick with emotion. My parents, they waited so long, he whispered. They died without knowing. But now Mary has justice. Thank you, from the bottom of my heart. Thank you for never giving up. The fragile closure that had been violently ripped away by Leonard Croft's exoneration was now, finally, truly offered. John Keith Miller, for his part, made it clear he had no intention of fighting the charges. During a meeting with his appointed public defender, attorney Spencer Rudd, Miller was emotionless. I told them what happened, he rasped, his gaze fixed on the wall. No point in a long court process. I'm ready to spend the rest of my life in prison. His willingness to admit guilt, delivered with the same chilling detachment as his confession, simplified the legal path. On March 27, 2025, over 51 years after Mary Kathleen Schlais' murder, John Keith Miller appeared before Judge James Peterson in the Dunn County Circuit Court. The courtroom was packed, a solemn crowd eager to witness the final act of this decades-long tragedy. Don Schlais sat in the front row, a framed photo of his sister clutched in his hand. his eyes fixed on the man who had stolen her future. District Attorney Daniel R. Whitmore, a new prosecutor who had taken over the case in recent years, now stood before the court with undeniable evidence. He recounted the horrific details of Miller's confession, weaving them with the power of the forensic genetic genealogy that finally unmasked him. When Judge James Peterson asked Miller for his plea, he spoke clearly, his voice surprisingly firm for a man of his age. "No contest, Your Honor," he stated, signifying his acceptance of the charges without formally admitting guilt in court. This no-contest plea effectively ended the need for a long trial. Moving directly to sentencing, Judge James Peterson, his expression grave, acknowledged the weight of the moment. He addressed Miller directly, his voice ringing with the seriousness of half a century of justice denied. "Mr. Miller," he declared, his gaze piercing, "for 51 years, Mary Kathleen Schlais' family has endured unimaginable suffering, compounded by the painful miscarriage of justice that saw an innocent man wrongfully imprisoned. Your cold and calculated actions, followed by decades of unrepentant silence, represent a profound evil. The truth, however long buried, has finally come to light." With the solemn finality of the law, Judge Peterson delivered the sentence: life imprisonment for first-degree murder without the possibility of parole. The gavel struck a sharp, echoing sound that marked the definitive end of Mary's tragic journey and the agonizing quest for her killer. As the judge's gavel struck its final blow, a quiet, collective sigh swept through the courtroom. Don Schlais clutched the photograph tighter, a single tear tracing a path down his weathered cheek. John Keith Miller, a frail 84-year-old man, was led away, his world finally reduced to concrete walls and iron bars, a consequence long overdue. In the aftermath, the case of Mary Kathleen Schlais was finally and officially marked closed. Resolved. Captain Rowena Pierce, Detective Sergeant Isolde Cross, and Detective Quentin Lowe were praised by state and federal authorities for their tireless work and innovative use of genetic genealogy. The Schlais family issued a heartfelt statement, expressing their profound gratitude to the investigators and the IGG team for never giving up on Mary. A quiet reflection lingered regarding the Jolie Trulson murder. While similar in some aspects, Miller's specific confession about his light blue Corolla, direct contradiction to the gold sedan seen by Jolie's friends, made his involvement highly unlikely. Investigators were, however, reviewing other unsolved cases from the 1970s and 80s in Wisconsin and Minnesota, searching for any potential links to John Keith Miller, though so far, nothing else has been definitely tied to him. Detective Sergeant Isolde Cross, standing outside the Dunn County courthouse after the verdict, the chill spring air mirroring the somber relief she felt, looked out at the quiet town. She thought of Mary Kathleen Schlais, ever 25, vibrant artist whose dreams had been brutally stolen. She thought of Leonard Croft, unjustly stripped of a year of his life, a victim of circumstance and systemic pressure. And she thought of Don Schlais, whose unwavering hope had spanned half a century. The case had been a testament to the enduring power of modern forensic science, especially genetic genealogy, but also a stark reminder of the mistakes of earlier investigations and the deep human cost of delayed justice. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the quiet plains, Detective Sergeant Cross opened her notebook. She wrote one final line in the no-closed file for Mary Kathleen Schlais. Case resolved, killer convicted. Justice, though delayed for 51 years, finally found. No one is truly forgotten, and truth, however late, always finds its way to light. Thanks for being here and listening. Don't forget to hit the bell for our latest stories. Stay safe and take care with your loved ones. In the bone-chilling cold of February 1974, a young artist vanished while hitchhiking through Minnesota. Her body was later found in rural Wisconsin, brutally murdered with 15 stab wounds, along with a knit cap belonging to the killer lying 23 feet from her remains. A local man was quickly arrested and convicted of murder. But the truth behind it all revealed a grave failure of law enforcement, one that sent an innocent man to prison. The real killer remained hidden among the public, quietly watching from afar. 50 years later, a single hair from the knit cap at the scene traced the killer's family line through genetic genealogy. Yet the perpetrator himself was still unidentified. Then, a sudden thought struck the detectives. What if the killer had been adopted, a detail crucial enough to change everything? Before we dive into this haunting story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you love cases solved after decades, don't forget to hit subscribe to stay updated on more stories. Minneapolis, the bustling city nestled amid the snow-covered plains of Minnesota, was wrapped in the long, biting cold days of winter in February 1974. A brittle silence often descended with the heavy snow, broken only by the distant roar of traffic or the mournful cry of a train. The scent of pine and damp earth clung to the cold air, harsh reminder that spring was a distant promise. In a modest apartment on the city's south side, Mary Kathleen Schlais, woman whose spirit burned brighter than the coldest winter day, prepared for a journey. Born on November 11, 1949, in the quieter town of Champlain, Minnesota, Mary, now 25, had grown up in a large, noisy family. Her parents, Michael and Penelope Schlais, had always encouraged their children's passions. Mary's older brother, Dunn Schlais, had often lovingly teased her about her artistic intensity, but he was also her strongest supporter. From a young age, Mary's world revolved around the pure joy of creation. Her hands, often stained with charcoal or clay, were proof of her unyielding passion for art. By the time she reached high school, there was no doubt in her mind. Art was not merely a hobby, but a calling. Mary had pursued her passion with singular focus, enrolling in the rigorous fine arts program at the University of Minnesota. Her teachers, seasoned artists themselves, quickly recognized the unique spark in her work, a blend of raw talent and an almost otherworldly sensitivity. She excelled in both painting and sculpture, earning numerous scholarships and graduating with honors. Her pieces graced several local exhibitions, a significant achievement for a young artist. Her thirst for knowledge wasn't confined to the canvas. She'd spent a year studying abroad, emerging fluent in German and Danish, and was now carefully learning Japanese, each new language a brushstroke adding to the vibrant canvas of her mind. After graduation, Mary continued to chase her artistic muse. Her life was a nomadic pursuit of inspiration. Painting, while soul-enriching, rarely offered financial comfort, so she embraced a simple existence, saving every spare cent to fund her travels. She shared her small Minneapolis apartment with her friend Linnea Larson, a quiet, aspiring writer. When the call of another city, another state, or another gallery beckoned, Mary usually relied on the common mode of travel for those without a car: hitchhiking. In the mid-70s, hitchhiking wasn't viewed with the grim worry it causes today. Public transportation in many areas was spotty at best, and the notion of dangerous strangers lurking on every roadside hadn't yet been fully amplified by widespread media. Stories of disappearances traveled slower, confined largely to local whispers, allowing a naive trust to persist. For Mary, it was simply an efficient, economical way to traverse the country, connecting with the vast American landscape and the many faces that composed it. On the morning of February 15, 1974, Friday, Mary was planning a trip to Chicago to attend a much-anticipated art show. The journey of approximately 400 miles from Minneapolis was too ambitious for a single stretch, so her plan was to break it up, hitchhiking first to Madison, Wisconsin, and then continuing to Chicago from there. Around 10:30 a.m., she bid farewell to Linnea, her backpack slung comfortably over her shoulder, a hand-lettered sign bearing the word Madison held firmly in her grasp. She walked with a light step toward the highway, a faint plume of breath curling in the crisp air, her heart alight with artistic anticipation. Roughly 3 hours later, over 100 miles east, Dennis Brown, a local farmer with a weathered face and kind eyes, was driving his pickup truck along a remote, snow-lined rural road in Dunn County, Wisconsin. The road, barely more than a packed dirt track, wound through thick stands of pine and leafless hardwoods, a solitary artery cutting through the silent white landscape. Dennis was on his way back from a routine supply run to the small town of Colfax, enjoying the quiet solitude of the backroads. At some point, he turned onto a long dead-end path, a route he sometimes took to check on an old hunting blind. As his truck rounded a gentle curve, the scene ahead brought him to an abrupt, chilling halt. Parked haphazardly by the side of the track was a small gold-colored sedan, its engine seemingly off. Two figures stood beside a man and a woman. From his vantage point, as he slowly drove past, it appeared they were embroiled in a heated argument, their gestures sharp and agitated. He thought he even saw a flash of struggle. But the distance and the swirling snow made clear observation difficult. A prickle of unease, unwelcome whisper of something wrong settled in Dennis's stomach, nagging at him. He continued to the end of the road, turned his truck around, and headed back. But by the time he reached the spot, barely 5 minutes later, the gold sedan was gone. The only evidence of its recent presence was a churned patch of snow. Still, something else caught his eye, something dark and out of place against the stark white canvas. He slowed his truck, his breath catching in his throat as he registered the horrifying truth. There was a body lying by the side of the road, partially hidden by ASNOWDRIFT. Dennis, a man who had seen his share of misfortune, felt a cold dread clamp around his heart. He didn't get out. Instead, he sped home, the chilling image seared into his mind, and burst through his front door, gasping for his wife. Trembling, he recounted what he had witnessed, then urgently asked his neighbor, Wesley Thorne, serious man known for his calm demeanor, to accompany him back to the scene. When Dennis Brown and Wesley Thorne arrived back at the desolate spot, the reality was stark and undeniable. It was indeed a young woman, lying still in the snow, her vibrant colors dulled by the harsh winter light. A sickening patch of crimson marred her clothes, stark against the white. Without touching anything, the two men immediately drove to the nearest house, a farmhouse owned by the Donovan family, and from their rotary phone called the Dunn County Sheriff's Office. Sheriff Garrett Hines, a man with weary wisdom etched into his face, took the call, his voice tightening as he dispatched his deputies to the remote location. When Officer Valerie Finch and Deputy Travis Lawn arrived, their breath pluming in the icy air, they confirmed Dennis and Wesley's grim discovery. The young woman was tragically dead. A first examination revealed multiple stab wounds, a brutal end in the silent cold wilderness. Yet, a puzzling detail immediately caught their attention. There wasn't a significant amount of blood soaking the snow around the body. This suggested a horrifying possibility that she had been killed elsewhere and then carefully, coldly left at this desolate spot, a few feet from the body, half buried in the snow. Officer Finch spotted a man's knit Kappa stocking cap with a distinct orange and black pattern. It looked out of place, a potential lead from the perpetrator. Nearby, partially melted into the snow, she also noted a single cigarette butt, its red and white filter identifying it as a Marlboro Small. Seemingly insignificant detail she bagged as potential evidence. Forensic technician Warren Dade, arriving shortly after, tried to make casts of some tire tracks visible in the disturbed snow. But the unforgiving cold and the loose powdery consistency of the snow made it impossible for the casting material to set properly. The tracks remained a frustrating, uncaptured ghost of a clue. Beyond these few items, the scene offered little else. With no other immediate clues, the young woman's body was carefully transported to the Dunn County Medical Examiner's office for a full autopsy. Meanwhile, Sheriff Garrett Hines and Detective Craig Kozera, seasoned investigator known for his careful approach, began their interview with Dennis Brown. Their sole eyewitness. Dennis, still shaken, provided a description of the man he'd seen: white, slim-built, likely between 25 and 35 years old, about 5 feet 8 inches tall, with light brown hair. The car, he recalled, was a small gold-colored sedan, but he hadn't managed to catch the model or the license plate. Dr. Octavia read. The medical examiner carefully conducted the autopsy. Her findings confirmed the initial observations. The victim had been stabbed approximately 15 times in her upper body and back, dying from massive blood loss. Crucially, she also noted several defensive wounds on the victim's arms, clear signs that the young woman had bravely fought off her attacker in her final moments. However, Dr. Reed found no signs of sexual assault, a detail that immediately complicated the motive, ruling out the most obvious predatory explanation. During the examination, Dr. Reed carefully collected traces of blood and skin found under the victim's fingernails, potential goldmine of forensic evidence. Though the technology to fully use it was still decades away, she also carefully preserved several short strands of male hair found inside the distinctive orange and black knit cap recovered at the crime scene. As Dr. Reed continued her grim work, investigators worked tirelessly to identify the victim. After circulating her description, they finally made a positive identification: Mary Kathleen Schlais, back in Minneapolis. The somber knock on the door of Michael and Penelope Schlais' home shattered the quiet of the evening. Detective Craig Kozar delivered the devastating news with quiet seriousness, leaving the parents numb with disbelief. Mary, their vibrant artist, their bright, adventurous daughter, was gone. Moments later, Dunn Schlais, Mary's older brother, arrived to find his parents in a state of profound anguish, his own heart sinking under the weight of unimaginable grief. The following morning, beneath a grey, wind-whipped sky, Michael, Penelope, and Don made the agonizing drive to Dunn County. At the morgue, behind the cold pane of glass, they identified Mary's body. Her once lively features were now still, the light that had defined her extinguished. The sight turned their faint hope into a brutal, undeniable reality. Detective Craig Kozar immediately contacted Linnea Larson, Mary's roommate in Minneapolis. Linnea, clearly shaken, confirmed Mary's plans to attend an art show in Chicago and mentioned that she had taken her purse with her, an item notably missing from the crime scene. Piecing together the timeline, detectives calculated that Mary had left her Minneapolis apartment around 10 a.m., and her body was discovered roughly 3 hours later. The drive from her home to the remote location in Dunn County would have taken approximately an hour and a half. This grim math led them to a chilling yet highly probable conclusion. It was very likely that the person who picked Mary up in Minneapolis was the same individual who brutally murdered her. Based on Dennis Brown's description, Detective Craig Kozar worked with a sketch artist to create a composite image of the suspect. The sketch, a haunting approximation of a killer's face, was released to local newspapers across Minnesota and Wisconsin, accompanied by pleas for public help. A few tips did trickle in, but none offered concrete leads. At the same time, however, a disquieting undercurrent of suspicion began to form among the investigative team, slowly turning their attention toward their key eyewitness, Dennis Brown himself. Sheriff Garrett Hines and Detective Craig Kozar couldn't shake the unsettling fact that Dennis was on a remote dead-end road, a place rarely visited by casual travelers. No other witness had confirmed his sighting of the gold sedan or the man he described. Moreover, parts of Dennis's story didn't quite sit right. When pressed, Dennis claimed he'd gone to the store that day and, on the way back, decided to keep driving, taking a turn onto the secluded dead-end road. His explanation for this detour was particularly unusual. He said his dog, his faithful companion, was with him in the car, and he simply thought she wanted to go for a longer ride. This reason, given the desolate location, raised more than a few eyebrows among the seasoned investigators. Another significant point of concern was Dennis's behavior immediately after finding the body. He hadn't gotten out of his truck, nor had he called the police from his home. Instead, he drove all the way back to bring his neighbor, Wesley Thorne, to the scene. The call to law enforcement only occurred after Wesley had seen the body for himself. To Detective Craig Kozar, it looked almost as if Dennis were deliberately trying to construct an alibi, at the very least, distance himself from the horrific discovery, creating a shared witness experience rather than acting alone. Despite these mounting suspicions, certain facts pointed away from Dennis's involvement. The faint tire tracks near the crime scene, though uncastable, appeared not to match his pickup truck. While this wasn't definitive proof of his innocence, another vehicle could have passed through earlier. It introduced a complicating factor. Furthermore, investigators couldn't find any evidence placing Dennis in Minneapolis on the morning Mary was picked up, making it highly improbable he could have given her the initial ride. Yet even this wasn't an absolute alibi. The possibility remained that Mary had gotten a ride from someone else first, and then tragically ended up in Dennis's truck later. Detective Craig Kozar and Sheriff Garrett Hines continued to press Dennis for answers, subjecting him to repeated interrogations. He remained steadfast in his story, his initial shock giving way to weary frustration. At one point, In a desperate attempt to unlock any buried memories or hidden details, they even brought in Dr. Theron Vance, a renowned hypnotist. Dr. Vance attempted hypnosis twice, but both sessions yielded no new information, leaving the investigators even more puzzled. Interestingly, amidst the sparse tips, an anonymous letter arrived at the sheriff's office urging them to take a closer look at Dennis Brown as a potential suspect. However, the letter offered no new information or concrete evidence, merely a vague, unsettling warning, with the Dennis Brown lead proving to be a frustrating dead end. Investigators reluctantly shifted their focus, desperately searching for any other possible avenues. That's when they stumbled across an unsolved case from 2 years earlier haunting echo that immediately caught their attention. The unsolved case from 2 years earlier that caught their attention involved a young woman named Jolie Trolson from Minneapolis. In 1972, Jolie had also decided to hitchhike home, and 15 hours later, her body was found near a river on the outskirts of the city. Detective Craig Kozar immediately saw the haunting similarities. Just like Mary, Jolie's friends had last seen her getting into a gold-colored car driven by a young man. And eerily, the medical examiner in Jolie's case had found no signs of sexual assault, ruling out a common predatory motive. Despite the striking similarities, the investigation into Jolie's murder had equally stalled, leaving no solid leads or clear suspects. Investigators tried to find any thread linking the two cases, any common factor that might point them to a shared killer, but every avenue proved to be a dead end. Several weeks after Mary's body was discovered, as news of the case continued to circulate across Minnesota, a young woman named Harper Winner, 22-year-old college student also familiar with hitchhiking, came forward. She told investigators that on the afternoon of February 17th, 2 days after Mary's murder, she had been picked up by a long-haul truck driver on the same stretch of highway Mary had likely traveled. Harper's voice, though calm, held an undercurrent of unease as she recounted her experience to Detective Kozar in the Dunn County Sheriff's Office. I saw the news about the girl," Harper began, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, "and it reminded me of something that happened." She described how, late on the afternoon of February 17th, she'd caught a ride with a man named Walter Wally Henderson, a gruff, middle-aged long-haul truck driver who regularly drove the Minneapolis-Chicago route. His truck, she recalled vividly, was a distinctive blue and white semi. Wally, she explained, was known for occasionally giving hitchhikers rides, often for the company, on lonely stretches of road. "He seemed nice at first," Harper told Kozar, her brow furrowed. "We talked for a while about the weather, about college. He was actually quite pleasant." Their conversation flowed easily, creating a deceptive sense of friendship as the big rig rumbled eastward through the fading winter light. They eventually pulled into the Oasis Roadhouse, a sprawling truck stop just outside Eau Claire, Wisconsin. The air inside the bustling diner was thick with the scent of coffee, griddle grease, and cigarette smoke, a comforting noise after hours on the quiet road. Wally, surprisingly thoughtful, insisted on buying her a hot meal. "He said I looked hungry," Harper remembered, a faint smile touching her lips at the memory of his unexpected generosity. "Bought me a huge plate of bacon and eggs with hash browns." Everything felt completely normal. It was after they left the roadhouse, back on the open highway with the vast snowy landscape stretching out before them, that Wally's behavior began to subtly shift. His comments grew increasingly familiar, his jokes veering into inappropriate territory. Harper initially tried to laugh it off, attributing it to trucker humor, but an uneasy knot began to tighten in her stomach. Finally, in the dim glow of the truck's dashboard, Wally explicitly asked her to have sexual intercourse with him. Harper, her heart suddenly pounding, immediately refused. "No, thank you," she said, trying to keep her voice firm but polite. The pleasant facade Wally had maintained instantly crumbled. His eyes, which had moments before held a glint of friendly mischief, hardened into a fierce, irritable glare. The air in the cab grew thick with menace. "He just kept driving," Harper whispered, her voice cracking, "even when I asked to get out. He just stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched." Terrified, Harper made a desperate, impulsive decision. She unzipped her jacket, leaned precariously out the passenger window, and began waving it frantically, a white flag against the encroaching darkness, hoping to catch the attention of another passing motorist. The sudden, desperate action visibly startled Wally. With a curse, he slammed on the brakes, pulling the semi-hard into the next available gas station alone. Dimly lit outpost further down the highway. Without a word, he ordered her out. Harper, shaking, grabbed her backpack and fled, never looking back. Before she left the truck, however, a detail had stuck in her memory. His arms, Harper said, her eyes meeting Kozar's. Both of them were covered in scratches, like he'd been in a fight or roar through a thorny bush. Her account, chilling and detailed, immediately catapulted Walter Henderson to the top of Detective Kozar's suspect list. The timing, the route, the gold sedan description provided by Dennis Brown, none of it had been as concrete as Harper. Wynn's terrifying close-up encounter. Sheriff Garrett Hines quickly authorized a full investigation into Walter Henderson. Finding a long-haul truck driver in 1974 was no easy feat, but through careful checks with various trucking companies and common truck stop networks, they finally traced Wally to a dispatch in Chicago. When Deputy Landon Pierce and Officer Valerie Finch eventually caught up with Wally Henderson at a truck yard in Illinois, he was preparing for another long haul. Wally was a powerfully built man, his face rough-hewn from years on the road, his eyes weary. His blue and white semi-truck, just as Harper had described, sat idling nearby. "Mr. Henderson, we'd like to ask you a few questions about a recent trip you made through Wisconsin," Detective Kozar stated, his voice calm but firm, once Wally was brought into the interrogation room at the local police precinct. Wally, arms crossed, listened intently, his gaze unreadable. After Kozar briefly explained the murder of Mary Kathleen Schlais, Wally's expression remained emotionless. He admitted to giving Harper Wynn a ride, but strongly denied anything inappropriate had occurred. "Just chit-chat," he grunted. "Dropped her off when she got squirrely. Some folks ain't cut out for the road." When asked about the scratches on his arms, which were still visible, Wally offered an immediate, if bizarre, explanation. "Syphilis," he mumbled, refusing to make eye contact. "Itches like hell. Always scratching myself." Kozar and Sheriff Hines exchanged a skeptical glance. It was a transparent lie, a desperate attempt to cover something. A search of his distinctive blue and white semi-truck, conducted with a warrant, yielded further unsettling clues. Hidden under the passenger seat, almost as if deliberately concealed, officers found a stack of well-worn Penthouse magazines. Confronted with the discovery, Wally Henderson became increasingly defensive. When Detective Kozar asked him to take a polygraph test, Wally scoffed, his face hardening. "Ain't no way," he said, shaking his head strongly. "Past run-ins, you know how it is. Cops always looking for a fall guy. Don't trust them one bit." His refusal, coupled with his evasive answers, only deepened the investigators' suspicion. Convinced they might be closing in on their man, investigators detained Wally Henderson for 2 weeks, relentlessly questioning him. They pressed him on his whereabouts on February 15, 1974, the day Mary was murdered. Wally, sullen but unwavering, insisted he was on a different route that day, hundreds of miles away. "In Ohio," he growled, delivering a load to Cleveland. While the circumstantial evidence against him was troubling, without a confession or a direct witness to Mary's murder, they desperately needed to break him. But Wally, despite his gruff exterior, held firm. He maintained his alibi, refusing to crack under the pressure. As the 2 weeks of detention drew to a close, a painstaking process of verification began. Detective Kozar and his team, though reluctant, were forced to carefully cross-reference Wally's logbook entries, his fuel receipts from various truck stops, and his delivery paperwork. Day after day, the tedious work continued, piece by agonizing piece. Finally, after exhaustive efforts, the truth emerged, crushing the detectives' hopes. Wally Henderson's alibi for February 15, 1974, was absolutely confirmed. Multiple independent records fuel receipts from a truck stop in Lima, Ohio, a way station ticket outside Columbus, and the stamped delivery paper for a warehouse in Cleveland conclusively placed him hundreds of miles away. Walter "Wally" Henderson, the gruff truck driver, with the unsettling gaze and the suspiciously scratched Arms was not Mary Kathleen Schlais' killer. He was merely another dead end. With Walter Wally Henderson definitely cleared by his solid alibi, the Dunn County Sheriff's Office found itself thrown back into the chilling vacuum of an unsolved murder. The initial flurry of activity, the intense interrogations, and the tantalizing leads had all dissolved into frustrating dead ends. The similarities with Jolie Trolson's unsolved murder from 1972, initially a source of fleeting hope, also proved to be a dead end. Despite the similar pattern of operation, a young hitchhiker from Minneapolis, a gold-colored car, no signs of sexual assault, a body found dumped in a rural area. Investigators, led by Detective Craig Kozar and Sheriff Garrett Hines, could not establish a concrete link. They interviewed Jolie's friends, Glenn Jenkins and Clara Thompson, who repeated seeing her get into a gold sedan, but their description of the driver was too vague to match Dennis Brown's composite sketch, let alone provide new direction. Every attempt to find a common thread, a shared suspect between Mary's and Jolie's cases, ended in the same maddening blank wall. As weeks bled into a relentless Minnesota spring, the official tips for Mary's case dwindled, and the initial energy of the investigation began to cool. Don Schlais, Mary's brother, took time off from his accounting job, spending time at the sheriff's office, desperate for any news. But Sheriff Garrett Hines and Detective Kozar had little to offer beyond weary reassurances. The composite sketch of the suspector, stark, unsettling face remained unrecognized, fading onto the back pages of local papers. Then, just as the investigation threatened to slip entirely into the cold files, a new, compelling lead emerged. In the neighboring county of St. Croix, Wisconsin, a woman named Kathy Hablia, careful homemaker, saw the composite sketch of Mary's killer in a local newspaper. Her heart seized. The face, hauntingly familiar, bore a striking resemblance to her reclusive neighbor, a man named Leonard Lenny Croft. Kathy, a nervous but responsible individual, hesitated for days, wrestling with her conscience, before finally picking up the phone to call her local law enforcement agency, the St. Croix County Sheriff's Office. The call was taken by Deputy Larry Sanders, a young officer on desk duty. Deputy Sanders listened intently as Kathy Hobley, her voice trembling slightly, described Leonard Croft. Lenny, a man in his late 20s, was slender and slightly taller, physical match to Dennis Brown's description of the perpetrator. He lived a quiet, withdrawn life in a small, somewhat run-down house on the outskirts of St. Quentin. Though married, his wife was rarely seen by neighbors, and their 10-year-old son often played alone in the yard. Crucially, Kathy mentioned that Lenny owned a small, faded yellow sedan, not gold, but close enough in certain light conditions to immediately spark interest. Recognizing the urgency and the potential connection to a high-profile case, Deputy Sanders immediately relayed the tip to Detective Craig Kozar and the Dunn County Sheriff's Office. Detective Craig Kozar and Officer Valerie Finch, a few days later, drove across the county line to St. Croix. They found Leonard Croft's address, a small, weather-beaten house tucked away down a gravel lane. As they approached, they saw the distinctive yellow sedan parked haphazardly in the driveway. Emerging from his front door carrying a small bag of trash, paused, his wary eyes darting nervously as the two officers stepped from their unmarked car. "Mr. Croft, Leonard Croft," Detective Kozar began, his voice calm, showing his badge. "Detective Kozar, Dunn County Sheriff's Office. This is Officer Finch from St. Croix County. We'd like to ask you a few questions if you have a moment." Lenny nodded slowly, clutching the trash bag, his gaze fixed on the ground. "About what?" he mumbled, his voice thin. "Mr. Croft," Kozar began calmly, "we'd just like to ask where you were on the morning of Friday, February 15th. Lenny's face went pale. He clutched the trash bag in his hand, his gaze fixed on the ground. I don't recall. I think I was at home, or maybe making local deliveries." His answer was vague, evasive. As they spoke, Kozar suddenly noticed the faint but unmistakable scent of tobacco clinging to Lenny. "You smoke, Mr. Croft?" Lenny finally met his eyes, a flicker of suspicion in his own. "Sometimes, yeah. Why?" Kozar paused, then, with a casualness that hid the tension, asked, "You smoke Marlboro Red too?" Lenny's shoulders relaxed a little, a hint of something almost like pride in his hesitant reply. Marlboro Red is my preferred brand of cigarettes. A small, almost imperceptible nod passed between Kozar and Officer Finch. The cigarette butt found at Mary's crime scene, Marlboro Red now, had a potential owner. Mind if we step aside and talk for a moment? Mr. Croft, Kozar suggested, gesturing toward the edge of the driveway. Away from the yellow sedan, as Lenny, looking increasingly uneasy, agreed. Officer Finch took a few casual steps toward the yellow sedan. She didn't touch it, only walked a slow circle around it, crouching once to note the tire make and tread pattern. From her coat pocket, she drew a small notepad and jotted a few quick measurements, gauged roughly against the span of her hand. Every movement was quiet, deliberate, practiced. After gathering this initial information, Lenny's short, vague answers about his whereabouts that February, the confirmation of his preferred cigarette brand, and Officer Finch's subtle observation of his tires, they had no grounds for an immediate arrest. Still, a grim satisfaction settled over Kozar as the officers thanked him and left. Later, in a low voice on the drive back, Finch mentioned what she'd seen. The sedan's tires matched the size and tread pattern of the hard-to-trace tracks collected by forensic technician Warren Dade. Kozar's expression didn't change, but inside he knew the web was tightening over the next few days. As Detective Kozar carefully compiled the first findings, the evidence mounted: a man matching the suspect's description, a yellow car that could be mistaken for gold, a Marlboro Red cigarette brand linking him to the crime scene, and consistent tire tracks. The final piece, Lenny's nervous behavior and evasiveness during their brief informal questioning, sealed it. A warrant for Leonard Croft's arrest was swiftly issued. The pressure on the Minneapolis Police Department and the Dunn County Sheriff's Office was immense. Chief James C. Crawford, of the Minnesota State Patrol,